Truth Told Go Deeper friends, it's great to see you today. I'm talking today about hearing from God. And I believe that as Christian people, we can hear God speaking to us. And this happens in many different ways. It happens primarily through God's Word, the Bible. We believe that this is God's voice to us. This is God speaking to us right here and now, today. I believe that God speaks to us today. God is longing to speak to us when we've got a relationship with Him, like we have with anyone else. Generally, when we've got a relationship with someone, we can hear them and they can hear us. And God is just exactly the same. We can hear Him. We can speak to Him. That is what prayer is. And we can hear His voice. And what He says to us is worth listening to and worth building our lives upon. We can hear God if we choose to listen carefully and let Him speak into our hearts and into our lives. I remember when our children were younger and the telephone would ring, perhaps it would be an important call. I would find myself then scurrying around the house trying to find a quiet corner with which to have this important conversation. I've seen me hiding in cupboards, in ensuite bathrooms, and locking the door and trying to listen carefully to that voice, to block out other voices for now and listen to that one important voice. And it's like that in our lives as a Christian. We need to block out some other voices sometimes and listen to that important voice of God as He speaks into our lives. I need to go to a place where I can hear God speaking to me clearly and listen sensitively to that and act upon it. There's that lovely old hymn that says, "Oh Jesus, I have promised to serve you to the end." And verse 3 says this, "Oh, let me hear thee speaking in accents clear and still, above the storms of passion, the murmurs of self-will. Oh, speak to reassure me, to hasten or control. Oh, speak and make me listen, thou guardian of my soul." And as Christian people, we need to be continually hearing what God is saying to us in our hearts. So when we hear God's voice, three things happen. We are directed by God's voice, we are comforted by God's voice, and we are challenged by God's voice. John chapter 10 and verse 3 to 4 says, "The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know His voice." I've seen this happen so many times with the sheep that we have as a family. They really do know Glenn's voice, and when he goes there and calls them in his own distinctive way, they do follow him. Sheep do know their shepherd's voice, and so it is with God. He wants us to know clearly His voice. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 6, an account of Paul, it says, "So he, trembling and astonished, said, 'Lord, what do you want me to do?' And the Lord said to him, 'Arise and go to this city, and you will be told what you must do.'" God was speaking to Paul really, really clearly. When Abraham in the Old Testament heard God speak, it changed not only his own life, but it changed the future course of history, because he received a word from God. It was specific and personal, and yet it had a huge implication for many people that followed after him. He acted upon God's word, and it transformed the world at that known time. You and I also need to act upon God's word for ourselves, and so that has an impact on people around us too. And so it was a very specific, direct voice from God that these people heard. And secondly, it's a comforting voice of God that we hear, bringing healing and comfort both to our wounded hearts and to those around us who we know and who we do life with. Psalm 85 and verse 8 says, "I will hear what God the Lord will speak, for He will speak peace to His people." Isaiah 40 verse 2 says similarly, "Speak you comfortably to Jerusalem and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned." Speak comfortably. Isn't that a lovely expression? Speak comfortably. Speak in a caring way. It's to do with comfort of the feelings and of the emotion. Speak comfortably to Jerusalem. Thirdly, we are challenged to obey what God says to us. In Genesis chapter 3 verse 8, Abraham heard and obeyed God's voice. Moses did similarly. Moses heard and acted upon God's voice. We read this in Deuteronomy 5 verse 24. Samuel heard God's voice clearly in 1 Samuel chapter 3 21 to chapter 4 verse 1. David clearly heard God's voice in Psalm 60 verse 6. And the course of history can be changed when God's voice is obeyed, as we understand from these characters: Abraham, Moses, Samuel and David, and there are many, many more in the Bible. These Old Testament characters opened up their heart to hear God's voice, listened carefully, waited for a word, and hearing from God, they responded to what God told them to do. So how does God speak? God speaks in many different ways and in different ways to different people at different times. There's the audible voice of God. Samuel heard the audible voice of God in the book of 1 Samuel. He thought it was Eli that was speaking to him in the night, but it wasn't. It was the voice of God, the audible voice of God. God speaks to us in visions, things that we see while we are awake. With our eyes open or closed, God can speak to us in visions. He can speak to us in dreams, a dream that is remembered really clearly. God can speak to us in those situations too. God speaks to us in nature. With nature all around us, he speaks to our hearts really powerfully. God can speak to us in special circumstances at certain times. He speaks to us primarily, though, through the scriptures, through God's written word. And isn't it wonderful, after 2,000 years, those words still speak into our everyday lives and change us for the better. The scriptures are solid evidence that can be backed up time and time again. It is God's word. But in Hebrews chapter 1, it says about in these times, God speaks to us through his Son. Matthew 17 verse 5 says, while God was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud saying, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Hebrews 1 verse 1 to 2 says, but in these last days God has spoken to us by his Son. Matthew 17 verse 5 says, while God was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. So how do we know if God is speaking to us? We have to weigh it up. We have to match it with what is being said in God's written word. We have to match it up with the heart and the nature of God. And we have to match it up whether it pleases and whether it glorifies God. But one thing we know for sure, that God still speaks to us. He speaks to us today, and we will do really well if we listen to his voice and put it into practice. So God bless you today. Have a great day.